Did you know that beneath the flat, seemingly peaceful plains of America's heartland lies a network of underground nuclear missile silos dense enough to make any foreign military strategist lose sleep? Did you know that a single tornado outbreak across the central United States once killed more than 300 people in a single day, and that the same stretch of land produces over 40% of all the food calories consumed across the entire nation every year? The place most Americans drive through without stopping, the place flyover country jokes are made about, is quietly one of the most consequential, dangerous, and deeply strange corners of the entire planet. These are 32 facts about America's heartland that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the middle of this country. Let's start with number 32 and work our way down to the fact that will genuinely change how you see this land forever. Fact number 32. The tornado capital of the entire world is not a metaphor. Here is something most people think they understand, but actually don't. They hear the phrase Tornado Alley and picture some dramatic weather map on a news channel. But the surface reality is almost too extreme to process. Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and parts of Texas sit inside a geographic corridor that generates more violent tornadoes per square mile than any other region on Earth. Full stop. Now here is the reversal. Scientists have known for decades that this isn't random bad luck. It is a deliberate collision of atmospheric forces unlike anything else on the planet. Warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico meets dry, hot air from the Chihuahuan Desert, while simultaneously crashing into cold Arctic air pouring down from Canada. The Great Plains act as a flat, unobstructed ramp where these three air masses have absolutely nowhere else to go except violently upward. Data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration confirms that the central United States experiences an average of over 1,200 tornadoes every single year, which accounts for roughly 75% of all tornadoes recorded globally. The region has documented tornadoes with wind speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. A single event, the Tri-State Tornado of 1925, traveled 619 miles across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, killing 695 people. Still the deadliest single tornado in American history. The deeper reality is that people who live here aren't unaware of the danger. They are simply the product of generations of communities that chose to stay, built storm cellars, developed emergency response systems, and in doing so, accidentally became the world's leading experts on tornado science. Every major breakthrough in tornado warning technology came from research conducted right here. Fact number 31. There is more fresh water under the plains than most countries have total. You look at Kansas or Nebraska and you see dry, flat, windswept land. That is the surface. Underneath that surface sits the Ogallala Aquifer, also called the High Plains Aquifer, which is one of the largest underground freshwater systems ever discovered by modern science. It stretches beneath approximately 174,000 square miles across 8 states. Now here's what flips the entire picture. That aquifer took between 3 million and 10 million years to accumulate. Rainwater slowly percolated through rock formations over geological timescales. Today, farmers are drawing from it at a rate 300 times faster than it naturally recharges. Research published by the United States Geological Survey estimates that in some sections of the aquifer, particularly in Kansas and Texas, water levels have dropped by more than 150 feet since large-scale irrigation began in the 1950s. At current rates, critical portions of the aquifer will be functionally depleted within the lifetimes of children who are alive today. Roughly 30% of all groundwater used for irrigation across the entire United States comes from this single buried reservoir. When it is gone, the agricultural output of the Central Plains, which currently feeds hundreds of millions of people, will require a complete and radical restructuring. Scientists, economists, and geographers have been sounding this alarm for decades. The aquifer is invisible, so the crisis remains largely invisible too. That is the terrifying part. Fact number 32. Wait, I want to pause for one personal moment here. I grew up seeing images of the Great Plains as the most boring landscape imaginable, Golden wheat, blue sky, flat horizon. I genuinely believed there was nothing interesting happening there. Researching these facts rewired my brain completely. What looks like emptiness from a car window is actually one of the most geologically, ecologically, and historically layered places on Earth. Keep that in mind as we go deeper. Fact number 30. The United States Army built ghost forts across the plains that are still haunted by their own brutal history. Between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the formal conclusion of the Indian Wars campaigns in the 1890s, the United States Army constructed over 100 military installations across the Central Plains. These were not symbolic gestures. They were the logistical infrastructure of one of the most systematic land seizure campaigns in modern history. The surface story is forts, soldiers, frontier expansion. The reversal is that many of these forts were established in direct violation of treaties the federal government had signed just years earlier. Fort Laramie, Fort Riley, Fort Dodge, and dozens of others served as staging grounds for campaigns against Native American communities who had legal claim to the very land the forts occupied. Data from the National Archives shows that over 370 treaties were signed between the United States government and Native nations between 1778 and 1871. The vast majority were broken, modified, or ignored entirely within a decade of signing. The ghost dance movement of the late 1880s, which spread across the plains from Kansas to the Dakotas, emerged directly from communities facing the complete destruction of their way of life. The Army responded to this spiritual movement, which posed zero military threat, by increasing troop deployments. The Wounded Knee Massacre of December 29, 1890, killed at minimum 150 Lakota people, with some estimates ranging far higher. The soldiers involved were later awarded Medals of Honor. Efforts to rescind those medals have been ongoing for decades. Fact number 29. The plains produced the single worst human-made environmental catastrophe in North American agricultural history: the Dust Bowl. Everyone learns 2 sentences about it in school. Here's the part that deserves much more time. During the 1930s, a combination of severe drought and catastrophically misguided farming practices stripped approximately 100 million acres of topsoil from the southern and central plains. Dust storms, called black blizzards, rolled across the landscape like walls of darkness hundreds of feet high. The ecological system that had maintained this land for millennia was a deep-rooted native grassland ecosystem called the mixed grass prairie. Settlers had plowed it under within 50 years of large-scale agricultural arrival. Without those root systems holding the soil, when the drought came, the land simply blew away. The Dust Bowl displaced somewhere between 3.5 million and 5 million people, the largest internal migration in United States history up to that point. John Steinbeck documented the human wreckage in The Grapes of Wrath, but the agricultural reports from the era tell an equally devastating story. Some farms lost 6 inches of topsoil, representing thousands of years of biological accumulation in a single decade. The Soil Conservation Service, established in response, developed practices that partially stabilized the land. But as a source cited by researchers at the University of Kansas notes, topsoil in the region continues to erode at rates significantly faster than natural replenishment even today. Fact number 28. The Heartland is where American nuclear strike capability lives, and it lives very close to your neighbor's fence line. Drive across rural North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska, or Missouri, and you will pass within miles of underground nuclear missile silos that most Americans do not think about in their daily lives. The surface fact is simple enough. The United States maintains a ground-based nuclear deterrent called the Minuteman III missile system, with hundreds of silos distributed across the Central Plains states. Here is the depth behind that surface. These silos were deliberately spread across sparsely populated agricultural land during the Cold War for a strategic reason. Any enemy strike targeting the silos would need to detonate individual warheads across thousands of square miles of farmland, making a comprehensive first strike enormously complicated and destructive. The Central Plains were, in essence, deliberately turned into a nuclear target zone. The people farming that land live with this reality, largely without drama. Research from the Air Force Global Strike Command indicates that these missile fields cover areas across 6 states, and the farms and ranches sitting above them are privately owned. Some farmers have silo access hatches literally in their fields. Congressional Budget Office assessments have estimated that modernizing the ground-based strategic deterrent will cost over $95 billion over the coming decades. The missile systems buried under the American Heartland represent one of the largest standing military investments in human history, and you can drive past a silo without even knowing it. Fact number 27. The greatest mass extinction event in the last 20,000 years happened right here. When the last ice age ended approximately 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, North America lost over 70% of its large mammal species in what paleontologists call the late Pleistocene extinction. The Heartland was at the center of this biological catastrophe. The Great Plains once supported animals that would seem surreal to modern eyes: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, horses, camels, giant armadillos, and a lion larger than anything living in Africa today. The surface narrative says climate change killed them. The scientific debate is considerably more complicated. Research published in peer-reviewed journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, has sustained a debate for decades over whether human hunting, specifically the arrival of Clovis culture peoples across North America, was the primary driver, the contributing factor, or a secondary cause behind these extinctions. Clovis spear points have been found embedded in mammoth bones in multiple Great Plains locations. The timing of extinctions correlates closely with human arrival patterns. The scale of what was lost is almost impossible to appreciate. The American prairie that European settlers encountered in the 1800s, already described as teeming with bison numbering in the tens of millions, was itself an ecologically impoverished shadow of what had existed just 11,000 years earlier. Fact number 26. A single storm system over the Central Plains once changed the outcome of American history. This fact is obscure enough that most American history textbooks don't cover it at all. In the spring of 1862, as the Civil War was tearing the nation apart, a series of catastrophic floods and unusual weather patterns across the central Mississippi River Valley and its tributaries disrupted Union supply lines and troop movements in ways that delayed several key military operations. Meteorological history is not the kind of evidence that comes with clean documentary citations, but climate historians studying military campaign records have identified specific weather events across the Heartland corridor that influence the timing of campaigns from Shiloh to Vicksburg. More dramatically documented is the role of the blizzard of 1888, called the School Children's Blizzard, which struck on January 12th of that year across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, Kansas, and Minnesota. It struck in the afternoon when children were in school, temperatures dropping from above freezing to dozens of degrees below zero in hours. Over 235 people died, many of them children who became disoriented walking the short distance between schoolhouse and home. The storm fundamentally altered settlement patterns in the northern plains and influenced the political conversations about federal responsibility for rural infrastructure that shaped the region for generations. Mid-roll moment. Before we get to the next 25 facts, I want to ask you something directly. Of all the things we have covered so far, which one genuinely surprised you most? The nuclear silos under farmland? The aquifer running dry? The extinction event nobody taught you about? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if you are watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it. We cover the hidden history of places that most channels don't think are worth exploring, and we do it every single week. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. You won't regret it. Now, this is where the Heartland stops being strange and starts being genuinely haunting. Fact number 25. The buffalo slaughter was a deliberate government policy, not a market accident. By the 1870s, there were an estimated 30 million to 60 million bison living on the Great Plains. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. The surface story most people know is that hunters killed them for hides and tongues. The darker truth, which is well documented in congressional records and military correspondence, is that senior United States Army commanders, including General William Tecumseh Sherman and General Philip Sheridan, explicitly encouraged and facilitated the mass killing as a military strategy. Destroying the bison destroyed the food supply, the spiritual foundation, the economic base, and the mobility of Plains Indian nations. Sheridan is documented as having stated publicly that buffalo hunters were doing more to solve the Indian problem than the Army had in decades. Proposals in the Texas legislature to protect the remaining bison were opposed by federal military officers who understood the strategic value of extermination. The transformation of 30 million animals to near zero in under 20 years was the fastest large-scale wildlife elimination in recorded human history, and was achieved through a combination of market incentives, industrial-scale hunting, and explicit governmental encouragement. Fact number 24. The Great Plains sit directly above a geological superstructure that could trigger continental-scale earthquakes. The New Madrid seismic zone is not located in California. It sits beneath Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, squarely within or adjacent to the eastern Heartland. Between December 1811 and February 1812, this zone produced a series of earthquakes now estimated at magnitude 7.5 to 8.0 that were among the most powerful ever to occur east of the Rocky Mountains. These earthquakes caused the Mississippi River to temporarily run backward in some locations. They rang church bells in Boston. They created new lakes and swallowed entire forests. Modern research from the United States Geological Survey classifies this zone as one of the highest seismic hazard areas in North America. Yet, the population, infrastructure, and construction standards in the surrounding region reflect almost none of the earthquake preparedness found in California. A major New Madrid event today would affect an estimated 12 major cities and 40 million people in areas with minimal earthquake-resistant infrastructure. Fact number 23. The Heartland contains the largest cave system in the world, and most people drive right past it. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is the longest known cave system on Earth, with over 426 miles of surveyed passages, and researchers believe the total extent of connected passages could be significantly larger. The cave system formed over hundreds of millions of years as slightly acidic groundwater dissolved limestone bedrock. It contains at least 10 unique ecosystem zones, host species found nowhere else on Earth, and was a major source of saltpeter for gunpowder production during the War of 1812. Beyond Mammoth Cave, the wider karst geology of the Heartland states, including Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas, contains tens of thousands of cave systems. Some of these have never been fully mapped. Missouri alone has more than 6,000 known caves. The underground world beneath America's heartland is, in terms of sheer physical scale, one of the great unexplored wilderness areas remaining in the developed world. Fact number 22. The largest meteorite impact in North American recorded geological history struck the heartland. The Chicxulub impact that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago struck in what is now the Gulf of Mexico. But there is a lesser-known impact structure sitting beneath the American Midwest that is quietly extraordinary. The Decorah impact structure in Iowa, discovered relatively recently and confirmed through scientific drilling, represents a meteorite impact estimated at approximately 3.8 billion years in age, though some impacts in the region are considerably more recent. More dramatically relevant is the Manson impact structure in Iowa. A buried crater approximately 24 miles in diameter formed approximately 74 million years ago. This impact was once theorized as a possible contributor to the end Cretaceous extinction event before the Chicxulub discovery definitively took that title. Additionally, the Kentland crater in Indiana and the Glassford structure in Illinois indicate that the interior of North America has been struck repeatedly by cosmic objects throughout its geological history. The Heartland sits in a region of ancient, geologically stable continental crust that has preserved these impact records in ways that more tectonically active regions cannot. Fact number 21. The Civil War's most violent pre-war theater was not in the South. It was in Kansas. Between 1854 and 1859, Kansas Territory became the site of a guerrilla conflict so brutal and so politically significant that historians call it Bleeding Kansas. The violence was a direct preview of the Civil War and was, in many ways, the event that made the Civil War inevitable. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri and anti-slavery Free State settlers from New England flooded into Kansas simultaneously after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed residents to vote on whether to allow slavery. What followed was years of murder, arson, voter fraud, and organized political violence. John Brown, who would later lead the raid on Harper's Ferry, carried out the Pottawatomie Massacre in May 1856, killing 5 pro-slavery settlers in a single night. The sack of Lawrence, a Free State stronghold, by a pro-slavery mob destroyed the town and killed residents. Congressional investigations documented widespread electoral fraud, with pro-slavery Missourians crossing the border to vote illegally by the thousands. The Kansas conflict killed or displaced thousands of settlers and demonstrated to the entire nation that the slavery question could not be resolved through political compromise. It was a direct accelerant to the conflict that would kill more than 600,000 Americans. Fact number 20. The American heartland feeds more people than any empire in human history ever did. This is an economic and agricultural fact that deserves to be stated with the full weight it carries. The Central Plains states, primarily Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska, Kansas, and Minnesota, produce quantities of corn, soybeans, wheat, and pork that are genuinely without historical parallel. Iowa alone produces roughly 18% of the world's corn exports and roughly 30% of the hog production in the United States. Illinois and Iowa together produce more soybeans than Brazil produced as recently as the 1990s. The total agricultural output value of the 12 states commonly identified as the American heartland exceeds the gross domestic product of most individual countries. The United States Department of Agriculture tracks these figures annually, and the scale of production is almost impossible to emotionally process. There are individual counties in Iowa where the total corn harvest in a single year feeds more people than the entire population of some European nations. This productivity, now threatened by aquifer depletion, topsoil erosion, climate shifts, and the consolidation of farmland into fewer and fewer corporate hands, is not guaranteed to continue. Fact number 19. The world's most powerful locomotive ever built ran across the plains, and it was named after a myth. Union Pacific's Big Boy locomotives, introduced in 1941 and running primarily across Wyoming and the broader Mountain West approaches of the Heartland Corridor, are still the largest and most powerful steam locomotives ever built by mass production standards. Each one weighed over 1,208,000 pounds, stretched over 132 feet in length, and could produce 6,000 horsepower. They were built specifically to haul wartime freight over the Wasatch Mountains, and their operational territory crossed directly through the agricultural and energy heartland. The last Big Boy in regular service ran in 1959. One, numbered 4,464, was restored to operational condition and embarked on a national tour in 2019, drawing crowds of tens of thousands at every stop across the Central States. People who had never been to a train event in their lives drove hours to stand alongside a machine that represented something about American industrial ambition that is genuinely difficult to articulate, but immediately recognizable when you see it. Fact number 18. The largest single-day military training accident in United States history happened in the Heartland. At Camp Gruber in Oklahoma during World War II, and across the expansive training ranges of Kansas, Nebraska, and the broader Central Plains, the United States Army conducted the largest ground force training operation in history as it prepared for the campaigns of 1944 and 1945. The sheer concentration of military training activity across the Heartland during this period produced an accident rate that military historians have only recently begun to fully document. The Elgin Field and Fort Riley training accidents of 1943 involved artillery misfires, vehicle accidents, and training exercise fatalities on a scale that rivaled some actual combat actions. The military history of the Heartland during World War II is almost entirely absent from popular memory, despite the fact that the region trained the majority of American ground forces deployed in the European and Pacific theaters. Fact number 17. The most deadly flash flood in United States history happened in the heart of the continent. The Johnstown flood of 1889, which killed over 2,200 people, is often discussed in terms of industrial negligence, but flash flooding across the Heartland, river systems, has produced disasters of comparable scale and far greater geographic impact. The Great Flood of 1993, along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, inundated approximately 100,000 square miles. Over 15 million acres of farmland were submerged. 50 people died. Damage exceeded $15 billion, and that is a 1993 figure. The Army Corps of Engineers, which had spent decades building levees along these river systems, found that, in some cases, the levees actually worsened the flooding by channeling water more rapidly and forcing it higher. Research from the United States Army Corps of Engineers published in Flood Management Studies indicates that the Missouri-Mississippi River system, the largest in North America, drains over 1.2 million square miles of the continent. When unusual precipitation events occur simultaneously across that watershed, the result is flooding on a scale that the built infrastructure was never designed to handle. Fact number 16. There is a place in the Heartland where compasses stop working, and scientists can't fully explain why. The Iron Mountain region of the Missouri Ozarks and certain locations across the upper Midwest contain concentrations of magnetic iron ore deposits so dense and so close to the surface that compass needles behave erratically within measurable distance. This is a geophysical reality, not folklore. The Precambrian iron formations beneath Missouri, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin are among the richest iron ore deposits in the world. The Mesabi Range in Minnesota, which provided the iron ore for the steel that built most of early 20th century American infrastructure and armed the country during both world wars, sits atop a geological formation that is visibly magnetic. The concentration of ferrous minerals in the region is so intense that early surveyors using magnetic compasses found their land survey measurements were systematically incorrect in certain areas, which produced property boundary disputes that persisted for decades in Minnesota and Michigan. Fact number 15. The Heartland produced the most financially devastating agricultural crisis since the Dust Bowl in living memory. The American farm crisis of the 1980s is not a well-remembered event outside agricultural communities, but its scale and human impact were staggering. During the 1970s, land prices and commodity prices rose dramatically, and farmers across the Heartland borrowed heavily to expand operations. When interest rates skyrocketed under Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker's monetary tightening and commodity prices simultaneously collapsed in the early 1980s, farmers across the Corn Belt and Wheat Belt found themselves owing more on their land than it was worth. Between 1981 and 1987, approximately 230,000 farms went out of business across the Heartland states. Farm debt nationally peaked at over $215 billion. Suicide rates among male farmers in the Heartland spiked to levels significantly above the national average, a pattern that agricultural health researchers from organizations like the National Farmers Union documented extensively. Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, and Neil Young organized the first Farm Aid concert in September 1985, specifically to draw national attention to this crisis. The consolidation of agricultural land that accelerated during this period fundamentally changed the social structure of rural America. Fact number 14. The prairie ecosystem that once covered the Heartland is one of the most endangered ecosystems on Earth. The tallgrass prairie once covered roughly 170 million acres across the central United States. It was the dominant ecosystem of the Heartland, hosting thousands of plant species, hundreds of bird species, and the bison herds that numbered in the tens of millions. Today, less than 4% of the original tallgrass prairie remains. It is more endangered, by percentage, than the Amazon rainforest. What survives in protected areas like the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas and the Nature Conservancy's Flint Hills properties represents fragments of an ecosystem so thoroughly transformed that most Americans have no idea what they lost. The prairie was not a simple or static landscape. It was a dynamic, fire-maintained, deeply rooted biological community that stored enormous quantities of carbon in its soil, managed water cycling across the watershed, and supported biodiversity that agriculture has almost entirely replaced. Research from the Nature Conservancy indicates that the soil beneath intact tallgrass prairie contains some of the deepest and most carbon-rich organic layers found anywhere in the terrestrial world. Fact number 13. The Heartland is home to some of the most extreme temperature swings ever recorded in human history. The rapid temperature changes that occur across the Great Plains due to Chinook winds, cold Arctic fronts, and the absence of any topographic barriers are physiologically and infrastructurally extreme. The world record for fastest temperature rise in a short period is held by Spearfish, South Dakota, where on January 22, 1943, the temperature rose from -4 degrees Fahrenheit to 45 degrees Fahrenheit in exactly 2 minutes. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration still lists this as one of the most extreme meteorological events ever recorded. Temperature swings of 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit within a single 24-hour period are not rare in the northern plains. These extreme thermal cycles cause infrastructure damage, livestock deaths, and agricultural losses that the region accepts as simply part of life. The same geographic openness that makes the plains agriculturally productive, flat land with abundant sunlight and seasonal moisture, also makes it one of the most thermally volatile inhabited landscapes on the planet. Fact number 12. The world's largest hand-dug well is in Kansas, and the story behind it is about survival. The Meade County Artesian Well, also known as the Big Well in Greensburg, Kansas, was dug by hand beginning in 1887 and measures 32 feet in diameter and 109 feet deep. It was dug to supply water to the railroad and the town during a period when municipal water infrastructure was non-existent across the Central Plains. Every shovelful of dirt was carried up by hand. The engineering challenge of keeping the walls stable while digging through shifting subsoil layers required techniques that workers developed through trial and error with no formal engineering training. The town of Greensburg was almost entirely destroyed by a tornado on May 4, 2007. The well survived and became part of the rebuilt town's identity. The rebuilding of Greensburg as a model green energy community, largely powered by wind energy from the surrounding plains, became an internationally studied example of disaster recovery. Fact number 11. The most successful guerrilla raiders in American history operated across the Heartland. William Quantrill and his raiders, and later the separate but related gangs led by Bloody Bill Anderson, conducted guerrilla operations across Kansas, Missouri, and the broader border states that killed more civilian non-combatants than almost any other irregular force in American military history. Quantrill's raid on Lawrence, Kansas on August 21, 1863, killed approximately 150 to 200 civilians in a single morning. Men and boys were pulled from their homes and shot. The town was burned. The United States Army, despite having substantial forces in the region, was unable to prevent or immediately respond to the attack. Anderson's subsequent operations in Missouri in 1864 included the Centralia Massacre of September 27, 1864, in which unarmed Union soldiers were taken from a train and executed, and a pursuing Union cavalry force was then ambushed and destroyed with losses of over 100 soldiers. Several members of these raider bands, including Jesse James and Frank James, went on to become the founding figures of organized criminal gangs that operated across the Heartland for decades after the war. This is where the Heartland stops being strange and starts being haunting. Fact number 10. The Heartland contains mass burial sites, whose full scale has never been archaeologically documented. Across the Great Plains, battlefield sites from the Indian Wars, burial grounds from pre-contact Native American civilizations, and mass graves from epidemic disease outbreaks among indigenous communities represent one of the largest categories of undocumented archaeological heritage in the world. The epidemic diseases that swept across the Plains nations in the 18th and early 19th centuries before sustained European contact arrived in person killed such enormous percentages of some communities that villages were simply abandoned, and their dead remain in the earth. Archaeological surveys of the region have been conducted on a fraction of the territory. Sites including the Crow Creek Massacre site in South Dakota, dated to approximately 1325, contained the skeletal remains of almost 500 individuals who appear to have been killed in a single violent event and represent the largest known prehistoric massacre in North American history, per research published by the Smithsonian Institution. Fact number 9. The largest wind energy resource on Earth is right here, and it is being squandered. The Great Plains Wind Corridor, running from Texas through Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and into southern Canada, is classified by the United States Department of Energy as the single largest terrestrial wind energy resource on Earth. Annual average wind speeds across this corridor are sufficient to generate electricity from wind turbines at world-class capacity factors. If the wind resources of North Dakota and Kansas alone were fully developed, studies from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory have suggested that those two states could theoretically generate more electricity than the entire current United States consumption. The Central Plains are increasingly dotted with wind farms that are transforming the economic base of rural counties that were otherwise in demographic and economic decline. However, the total developed wind resource in the region as of the mid-2020s still represents a small fraction of what is technically and economically feasible. Fact number 8. The Heartland was the site of the most catastrophic flood insurance failure in United States history. The Missouri River flood events of 2011, which followed the devastating floods of 1993, submerged millions of acres of heartland farmland and caused damage that federal flood insurance programs were structurally and financially unprepared to handle. The Army Corps of Engineers made a series of controversial dam release decisions in 2011 that critics argued prioritized upstream reservoir capacity over downstream farmland and communities. Congressional hearings held in the aftermath documented that federal flood management infrastructure along the Missouri River was operating on design assumptions established in the 1950s that bore little relationship to actual precipitation and land use patterns in the 21st century. The total agricultural losses across Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Missouri in 2011 exceeded billions of dollars. Many affected farm families received insurance payments that covered only a fraction of actual losses, and some did not receive payments until years after the event. Fact number 7. The Heartland's underground salt mines are among the most surreal human spaces in existence. Beneath Hutchinson, Kansas, there is an operating salt mine that has been producing salt since 1923. It extends roughly 650 feet below the surface, across an area of approximately 150 acres. The salt was deposited in a vast underground sea, approximately 275 million years ago. Inside the mine, constant temperature and humidity conditions have made it one of the primary storage locations for irreplaceable historical and cultural records. Film studios, including Paramount, Disney, and Universal, have stored original film negatives in the Hutchinson salt mine because its environment prevents the chemical degradation that destroys nitrate film. Historical records, legal documents, and corporate archives from across the country are stored there. An underground city of human memory sits beneath the wheat fields of Kansas, maintained at a temperature that never varies by more than a degree, sheltering some of the most culturally significant film and paper records in American history. Fact number 6. The Heartland was the theater of operations for the largest domestic terrorist attack in United States history before 2001. On April 19, 1995, at 9:02 in the morning, a truck bomb containing a mixture of ammonium nitrate and nitromethane detonated in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. 168 people died, including 19 children in a daycare center located in the building. The bomb was constructed and detonated by Timothy McVeigh, a domestic terrorist motivated by anti-government extremism, who deliberately chose the date to coincide with the 2-year anniversary of the federal raid on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. The initial public assumption was that the attack was the work of foreign terrorists. The revelation that it was carried out by a United States Army veteran from the American Midwest was, according to contemporaneous media and political commentary documented in congressional records and news archives, a significant shock to the national self-understanding. The Oklahoma City bombing killed more Americans in a single domestic terrorist attack than any other event until September 11, 2001, and it came from within the Heartland itself. Fact number 5. The plains were home to the first transcontinental communications network in American history, and it changed the world in 18 months. The Pony Express, which operated from April 3, 1860 to October 26, 1861, carried mail across approximately 1,900 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, traversing the full width of the American heartland and beyond. It operated for only 18 months before the transcontinental telegraph rendered it economically obsolete. But the operational reality of the Pony Express, approximately 180 riders using 400 to 500 horses and maintaining more than 150 relay stations across plains, mountains, and desert, represented the first genuine attempt to create a real-time communications network across the continental interior. The telegrams that replaced it were transmitted along lines strung across poles that crossed the same plains terrain the riders had traversed on horseback. The Heartland was not just crossed by American expansion, it was the physical medium through which the nation first achieved something approaching real-time communication across its own geography. Fact number 4. The Heartland produced the environmental legislation that saved American wildlife, triggered by its own near disasters. The near-total destruction of the bison, the catastrophic topsoil loss of the Dust Bowl, and the chemical contamination of Heartland waterways by agricultural runoff during the 1950s and 1960s were primary drivers behind the environmental legislative revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, drew heavily on research conducted in the agricultural Midwest, where the impact of persistent pesticides on songbird populations was being studied. The political pressure that produced the Clean Water Act of 1972, the Endangered Species Act of 1973, and the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency came in substantial part from the visible, documented environmental destruction occurring in the nation's agricultural heartland. The heartland's ecological disasters, in other words, produced the legislative framework that now partially protects the nation's natural resources. Fact number 3. The Heartland is home to the most geologically unique landscape in the Western Hemisphere that almost nobody has heard of. The Sandhills of Nebraska cover approximately 19,000 square miles, making them the largest stabilized sand dune complex in the Western Hemisphere. They were formed from glacial outwash deposits that were subsequently shaped by wind during a dry period approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. The dunes are now stabilized by native grasses, but beneath those grasses the substrate is still sand, and in drought conditions, sections can begin to move again. The sandhills contain hundreds of natural lakes, ponds, and wetlands fed by the Ogallala Aquifer, making them one of the most important migratory bird habitats in North America. The Platte River, which flows through the heart of the Sandhills region, is used by an estimated 400,000 to 600,000 sandhill cranes during their annual migration, the largest single-species bird migration spectacle remaining in North America. The land looks gentle and rolling. It is actually a barely stabilized ancient desert sitting atop the water system that feeds 1/3 of the nation's food supply. Fact number 2. The Heartland is being hollowed out by a demographic collapse that could break the American food system. The rural Heartland is losing population at a rate that has no precedent in peacetime American history. Hundreds of counties across Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, the Dakotas, and Missouri have been losing population continuously for over 60 years. Small towns that once had hospitals, schools, grain elevators, hardware stores, and a community of several thousand people now have a gas station, a dollar store, and a median age above 55. The consolidation of agricultural operations into larger and larger corporate-owned units has dramatically reduced the number of farming families per acre of productive land. Rural hospital closures across the Heartland have accelerated since 2010, leaving geographic areas larger than some states without emergency medical services within reasonable driving distance. The social fabric of communities that once sustained the most productive agricultural landscape in human history is unraveling in slow motion. The United States Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service has documented this demographic contraction extensively, and the policy responses at both state and federal level have been modest in comparison to the scale of what is happening. Fact number 1. The Heartland is simultaneously the thing that made America and the thing America is forgetting it has. We started this video with a question embedded in facts. How is it possible that the most consequential, dangerous, geologically extreme, historically layered, ecologically critical, and militarily significant region in the United States is also the region most dismissed, most joked about, most overlooked in popular culture, most underfunded in policy discussions, and most abandoned by its own young people? The answer is as haunting as anything else we have covered. The Heartland does not produce spectacle. It produces substance. It does not have coastlines or mountain ranges or iconic skylines. It has aquifers and topsoil and missile silos and salt mines and mass graves and tornado records and extinction events, and the agricultural productivity that keeps 330 million Americans fed every single day. It produced the environmental laws that protect American nature, the food surplus that projected American power globally during the Cold War, the nuclear deterrent that sits silently under farmland, and the social crises, the farm bankruptcies, the opioid epidemic, the demographic collapse that nobody outside the region can quite bring themselves to care about long enough to act on. The first thing we said in this video is that flyover country jokes are made about a place that is quietly one of the most consequential spots on the planet. Everything we covered between that sentence and this one is the proof. The Heartland isn't hiding something deeply disturbing. It is disturbing only because we stopped paying attention, and everything that was quietly extraordinary about it kept happening anyway, without us. So here's the question I want you to sit with. If the region that feeds the nation, houses its nuclear deterrent, sits above the water system that irrigates a third of its crops, and contains some of the most extreme natural and human history on Earth, is this consistently invisible in national conversation? What else are we not looking at? What other critical systems are we treating as background while we focus on the coasts? Let me know in the comments what fact hit you hardest. Subscribe if you want to keep going down these roads with me. We are not done with the Heartland, and the Heartland is not done surprising us. I'll see you in the next one.